Welcome everyone to this important conversation on tariffs, global trade shifts, and the garment sector. Building a collective trade union response, hosted by AFWA Wage Alliance. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to share why a conversation like this really matters. Discussions on global trade are often framed through economic indicators and policy mechanisms. Tariffs, trade deficits, import duties, and economic policies. And while all those matters, at the core of this discussion are workers. The people who stitch garments for a living, who support their families on very limited wages. Yet, they are also the most vulnerable to the consequences of policy. It is to be examined not just as a trade or economic policy issue, but as a labor issue, fundamentally a human rights issue. As we saw during COVID-19, when orders were cancelled overnight, it wasn't the brands that absorbed the shock, it was the workers. And what we are seeing now with these tariff shocks risk repeating the same pattern. It was in this context that we undertook a rapid assessment in India. The objective was to gain timely insights into on-the-ground realities, particularly at the shop floor level, examining how these converging pressures are being experienced by workers, how businesses are responding, and where the most urgent gaps are emerging. And India's experience is not an isolated story. Evidence from other regions points to very similar patterns globally. Workers across countries are navigating a shared landscape of uncertainty, volatility, and heightened risk. Throughout this webinar, we will focus on key areas, sharing findings from the rapid assessment in India, and examine these trade shocks from a worker-centered and gendered lens. We will also connect what's happening at the national level with broader regional shifts in global trade and restructuring. And ultimately, we want to leave this webinar with the beginnings of a collective labor perspective, a shared framework for how unions, worker organizations, and advocates can respond together to trade-related disruptions. With that, I am delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists to the discussion. To start us off, I invite Haris Najib, National Coordinator for AFWA Wage Alliance in India, to present key findings from the rapid assessment. Haris has been closely involved in leading the rapid assessment that we will be discussing today. He will walk us through key findings, connecting recent trade shifts on the ground realities. Over to you, Haris.
Yeah, I hope everyone can see my screen, right? Can someone please confirm?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Aparna. Thank you for setting the context. So dear friends and comrades, thank you for joining the webinar. As we all are aware, this month, April, marks the first year since the US government announced the tariff measures on several countries, including India, which was in April 2025. So Indian garment sector was one of the worst affected sector because of the garment sector ties to the US market, how exposed because the garment sector of India is very highly exposed to the US market. So what we have seen that what began as a trade measure quickly changed into a geopolitical tool. As we have already seen in several during several occasions of such trade shift, the shock of the trade shift does not just end in the top layer; it always transfers downwards. So in the following months of the tariff announcement, we have seen the panic, disruption, and how the tariff has the shock has transferred down to through the supply chain. So the tariff has been reversed, the impact did not. So we as AFWA conducted an assessment along with the support of our union partners during the peak of the tariff disruption to understand the impact of the trade shock on the shop floor and how it's impacted the workers. So as what we try to understand through this assessment is how it has really impacted in the ground. So workers reported many issues like reduced shift, halted overtime, thinner lines, and their colleagues being quietly sent home or being terminated. The important thing is none of these were formally communicated by the management. So workers themselves became the early signal that something was changing. So let's see what did these changes actually mean at the level of the workers. So as you can see in this testimony, this particular testimony reflects what we repeatedly heard during the assessment. Workers being pushed to make decisions without information and without security. So across the major production hubs such as Tirupur, Delhi NCR, which includes Noida, Gurgaon, and also Bangalore, hundreds of thousands of garment workers are employed, especially women. So any small change in the global tariff situation or trade deals, the impact would be immediate. The consequences would be immediate. So workers have reported that they had observed fewer shift, loss of overtime, unannounced termination, rising household debt, and financial stress. Since the wages were already low, even minor disruption would transfer to a financial crisis for these workers. So throughout this study, from the analysis of the study, it's very evident that the tariff change directly translated into livelihood crisis. To understand how this situation has unfolded, just go through the timeline of the tariff. So as we all are aware, the tariff first was announced in April, which rose from 26% to 50% in a span of 4 months, especially for India. So AFWA conducted this particular assessment during the peak of disruption, which was in September 10 to 28. That's what the date we conducted this study. So this impact was particularly strong because of how dependent the Indian garment sector is to the US market. To understand how the impact of the disruption, these numbers are very important. So the US alone buys about 29% of India's garment export. Combining with EU, it calculates to 47%, which is nearly 50%. Especially the places which I have already mentioned, Tirupur, Noida, Gurgaon, Bangalore. These were the main areas we covered the study as well. So when the tariff changed, the impact was immediate and widespread. And this vulnerability became even more visible during the tariff shock. So this slide, you can see the tariff difference between India and the other, competing garment producers in South and Southeast Asia. So the tariff for India was rose to 50 to 64% for certain products. The competing countries had just 20% of the tariff. The US only imposed 20% of the tariff. So there was a sharp disadvantage for the Indian suppliers when the brands started shifting to other countries. Let's see how the brands responded to this situation. So the brands reacted in several ways. Some of them shifted their orders to the low cost countries where the tariffs were lesser than India. Some of them squeezed the margin by asking the suppliers to absorb the cost of the increased tariff. Some of the brands completely exited without any proper warning to the suppliers. Also, some of the major brands started sourcing through the overseas unit to bypass the tariff. So, as I've already mentioned, the pressure created on the top level, we can see how it has been passed on to the suppliers by the brands. And let's see how it further trickled down to the workers. So these are what the workers reported from the ground. They have reported reduced shift of fewer work days, production slowed down in specific lines, colleagues were terminated, sudden workflow changes, drop in overtime availability, and importantly, none of these were like clearly communicated by the management. So the sudden changes in workflow has increased uncertainty, and the, even though the disruptions were very visible, it was rarely acknowledged by the management. So to better understand the disruption and patterns, we did assessment across multiple regions. So these are the numbers. We covered around 46 factories in a span of 18 days and covered 145 workers in all the main garment production clusters. We also covered all the major departments such as production department, finishing department, packing department, etc. So let's see how the disruption varied across the regions. So here, if you see, around 50% of the factories that we surveyed reported some sort of disruption. The most consistent impact was in the regions where the exposure to the US market was higher. So clearly, we could see the link between export dependence and vulnerability. So next, we try to look at how the supplier adjusted. First, we have seen how the brands adjusted during the shock, how they passed it downward in the supply chain. So we also try to understand how the suppliers adjusted their workforce and further transferred the shock down the supply chain. So around 1/3 of the factories reported workforce reductions. These were not formal layoffs, but forced leave, immediate termination without any notice, suspension, dismissals were reported in majority of the factories. One important analysis that we had, one thing we identified, realized that the suppliers first target the most vulnerable workers who are not part of any worker collective or union. Those are migrant workers, those who join very new, and or also women workers. So the quiet terminations by the suppliers, by the management, was to avoid triggering, union responses, and also to evade legal obligations. So this indicates that the labor adjustments were not random, but structured around vulnerability. So in many cases, these reductions were not even visible. For example, as I've already mentioned, workers described that their colleagues started disappearing without explanations like overnight and no formal announcement. Even though the workers approached the supervisors, they gave vague answers that production is less. So the only way for workers to know what is happening was that they had to rely on rumors and observation, their own observation, which has created a high level of anxiety and uncertainty that reduced the possibility of collective response. One of the earliest and most widespread impact was on overtime, which was an early signal for workers that something wrong is happening in the factory floor. When it comes to overtime, it's a critical part of the government workers' income. As the basic wage is very less, the overtime often contributes to 30 to 40% of their monthly earnings. In our findings, more than half of the workers reported reduced or stopped overtime. And among these workers who responded to this, women accounted for around 80% of these cases. In many factories, overtime stopped completely. So this makes overtime loss as one of the earliest and clearest indicators of distress in the sector during the tariff period. To understand where these disruptions began, we looked at the department level changes. So these were the main departments we covered during our study. The highest disruption and the first disruption was observed in the production lines, which are directly related to the incoming orders. Workers, as I've already mentioned in the previous slide, workers observe thinning lines, idle machines, and reduced helpers. So this shows that disruption starts at the core of production and then move outwards to the other departments. So as these changes continued, workers began to anticipate deeper risk. So these changes had direct consequences for workers' lives as obvious. So these were the main concerns raised by the workers. The workers reported income loss, rising debt, difficulty managing household expenses. So there was a strong fear of sudden job loss without notice. They have seen how their colleagues disappeared from the production lines overnight. So this shows how quickly the factory level changes translate into household stress. And one important finding is that these impact were not experienced equally by all the workers. The impact was disproportionately impacted the women workers. So as they dominate the core production, the women dominate the core production roles, and production department was one of the first department that got affected by the tariff change. Women were deeply affected by this due to this disruption. Women also faced a lot of forced leave. And one of the main concern arise from the women workers that because of the mobility constraints and caregiving responsibilities, that limited their ability to find alternate work. But for by male workers, this concern was not shared at all, finding an alternative job. So this resulted in a clear double burden, both economic and social for the women workers. So the taken together, all these findings reveal three broader patterns. One, women workers absorb the heaviest burden whenever such a trade shock happens in the supply chain. And disruption starts at the production core, which is very much visible from the study. And the more the US dependent the factory was, the deeper the disruption was. So what does this mean for the union? One of the main findings is that, as I've already mentioned in my previous slide, factories prioritize reducing the least protected workers first. So many of these changes happen quietly, limiting collective response. So this highlights the importance of collective organization in times of crisis. So majority of the workers we interviewed were part of some sort of collective. And from their observation, we got to know that those who got terminated were not part of any unions and mostly were migrant workers and newcomers. So these were the key recommendations that AFWA put forth during the uh, tariff disruptions, which the panelists will be talking more about it. But these were the four main recommendations. Reject the weaponization of tariff in global geopolitical conflicts. Tariffs must be proportionate and regionally fair. Redirect tariff revenues to social protection for workers. And finally, hold the brands accountable for worker compensation. So, as I'm concluding, I want to say a few points. So, these assessments revealed, not just the disruption, but the pattern of the flow of shock in the supply chain towards the workers and how the system responded to the crisis. These were not isolated incidents. And from our study, what we have observed that was not just an impact, but how a system work during such crisis. That's all from my end. Thank you, Aparna. Aparna, over to you.
Thank you, Harris, for the presentation. To bring in a grounded shop floor perspective, I now invite our next speaker, Nagaragna Raju, State President of the Karnataka Garment Workers Union. With over 35 years of experience in the garment industry, Nagaragna has not only worked as a tailor, but has also been at the forefront of workers' struggles, standing up against workplace harassment, leading collective action for better working conditions, and actively shaping ongoing negotiations with management. She is also the co-chair of the Asia Brand Bargaining Group of India. Over to you, Nagaragna.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. Good evening to everyone. I'm speaking as a garment worker and also as a union member. I want to say one simple thing from my experience. Whenever something changes in the global economy, whenever big decisions are taken far away, it is workers like us who end up bearing the burden. ತೀರ್ಮಾನಗಳನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಾಗ ನಮ್ಮಂತಹ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಒತ್ತಡ ಪ್ರಭಾವನ ಬೀರುತ್ತೆ. We may not know all the details about tariffs or trade policies. These are not things workers are told about. But we feel the impact in our daily work. In many factories, we may not have seen very big changes yet, but there is always some uncertainty. Workers start feeling that things are not stable. Sometimes there is too much pressure to finish work fast, and sometimes there is less work. Even when nothing is clearly told to us, the pressure increases. When companies face problems, they do not reduce their profits first. They reduce the security of workers. They put more pressure on us and expect us to adjust to every situation. And when there is a serious problem, the first people to suffer are the most vulnerable workers.
ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಮೇಲೆ ಇದನ್ನ ತೋರಿಸಿ ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಲಾಭನ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿಗೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
Migrant workers face this the most. They are away from their homes and depend on the factory for their survival. Because of this, they cannot easily speak up. If they are asked to leave, they have very little support. During such times, workers become afraid. People worry about losing their jobs. Because of this fear, many workers do not raise their voice, even when something goes wrong. This makes it very difficult to organize workers.
ಅತಿ ದುರ್ಬಲನ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ಆ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರ್ತಾರೆ.
But this is also the time when unions are most needed. When there is a union, workers are not completely alone. There is someone to ask questions and to stand together. There is some strength. Without unions, management can take decisions without informing workers, and workers have no way to respond.
ಅವರನ್ನು ಕೆಲಸ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಬಹಳ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಬೆಂಬಲ ಇದೆ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ವಲಸೆ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರಿಗೆ ಬೆಂಬಲ ಇಲ್ಲ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ
I also want to say most garment workers are women. When pressure increases in factories, women face it even more. We have to manage both work and home. Stress increases, and sometimes disrespect at the workplace also increases. So these changes do not affect everyone in the same way. For us, these are not big policy issues. These are daily life issues. They affect our jobs, our income, and our dignity. That is why workers must be part of these discussions, and we must build stronger unity among ourselves.
ಆದರೆ ಈ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಯೂನಿಯನ್ ಅತಿ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇರುವುದು. ಯೂನಿಯನ್ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರು ಒಬ್ಬಂಟಿ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ.
I want to end by saying again that whenever such changes happen in the global economy, it is workers who carry the burden. So our voices must be heard and our rights must be protected.
ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರಿಗೆ ಏನು ತಿಳಿ ಹೇಳದೆ ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು, ಅವರಿಗೆ ಏನು ವಿಷಯನ ತಿಳಿಸ್ತಾರೆ ಆ ತೀರ್ಮಾನನ ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ತಗೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೆ. ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರತಿಕ್ರಿಯಿಸಲು ಆಗೋಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೇಳುವುದು ಏನೆಂದರೆ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಗಾರ್ಮೆಂಟ್
workers are not usually informed when the management takes some decision. So when they are not informed, they can't respond in a proper way.
ಮೇಲೆ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಪರಿಣಾಮ ಬೀರ್ತದೆ. ನಾವುಗಳು ಕೆಲಸ ಮತ್ತು ಮನೆ
women workers are the ones who are affected the most.
ಬಿಸಿ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಕೆಲವು ಬಾರಿ ಕೆಲಸದ ಸ್ಥಳದಲ್ಲಿ
they face work pressure in the office as well as they have to go back home and face
ಪರಿಣಾಮನ ಬೀಳ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
pressures at home.
ನಮಗೆ ಇದು ದೊಡ್ಡ
So this affects them
ಇದು
a lot.
ದಿನನಿತ್ಯದ ವಿಷಯಗಳಾಗಿವೆ. ಅದು
So these are just not policy issues, they affect our lives. So life issues, daily life issues. It affects our job, our income, our dignity. So workers, I insist that workers must be part of these discussions. Only then we can build stronger unity among ourselves.
ಜಾಗತಿಕ ಆರ್ಥಿಕತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾದರೂ ಇಂತಹ
So
ಬದಲಾವಣೆ
whenever such changes happen in the global economy, it is the workers who carry the burden. So our voices must be heard and our rights must be protected. Thank you.
ಕೇಳಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕು. ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಸಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಹಕ್ಕುಗಳಿಗೆ ಐಕ್ಯತೆನ ತಗೊಂಡ್ಬರ್ಬೇಕು. ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರು ಯಾವುದೇ ಭಯ ಇಲ್ದಿರ ನಿರ್ಭಯ ಇರ್ಬೇಕು. ಅವರು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡೋ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ತೊಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ದಿರಂಗೆ ಆ ಕೆಲ್ಸದ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಗೌರವನ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರಲ್ಲಿ ಉತ್ಪಾದನೆ ತೆಗೆಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕೆ ಹೊರ್ತು ಈ ಒಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರೆ ದಿನನಿತ್ಯ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಮೇಲೆ ಏನೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾನಸಿಕವಾಗಿ ಒತ್ತಡನ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಸಾಯುವಂತ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ತಗೊಂಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನೀರ್ ಕುಡಿಯಕ್ ಹೋಗಕ್ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ವಾಶ್ರೂಮ್ ಹೋಗಕ್ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಬರೀ
So we
ಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್
can't even drink water, can't even go to washroom. They just keep
ತುಂಬಾ
forcing us to concentrate on production.
ಇದಿಷ್ಟು
They,
ನಾನು ಏನ್ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೀನೋ ಅದನ್ನ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ.
so whatever I'm aware of, I'm sharing it with you.
ನೀವು ನ್ಯಾಯ ಕೊಡಿಸ್ತಿರೋ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ.
So I don't know how we are going to bring justice, do justice for the workers, but I want to share my concerns about the workers.
ಅದನ್ನ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನೀವು ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ಮಾಡಿ ಇಷ್ಟೊತ್ತು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಮಯ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
So please come up with a decision,
Thank you,
come up with
Nagya,
some
for
idea
such
to
powerful
solve this problem.
perspective.
Thank you for this
Now, I would like to
opportunity to speak.
introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ritu Devan. She is a distinguished economist with decades of work on development, public policy, and women's rights. A pioneer in gender economics, she was the first woman director of economics at the University of Mumbai and a founder member of Asia's first Center of Gender Economics. She has worked extensively with institutions like ILO and UN Women and has held several leadership roles, including conference president of the Indian Society of Labor Economics. She will help us unpack the gender dimensions of trade and supply chain pressures and why these impacts of tariff changes hit women workers harder because of existing inequalities. Over to you, Dr. Ritu.
Thank you so much, Aparna. I'm so glad that you're having this event. It's something which is so urgent, so important, and not really talked about. In 10 minutes, of course, there's a lot to cover. So I will start straight away. And of course, as we know that any kind of a trade shock, including the sudden tariff changes, which have occurred in the last few months, that they don't occur in a vacuum. They occur or are implemented and interact with increasing inequalities, which are very heavily gendered, whether they're economic structures, class, caste, community, extra-economic, etc. And therefore, they will always impact where there is patriarchy and patriarchal rigidities. They will always impact women very much more. Now, India is, of course, some data has already been shared by Harris in his presentation, that India is, in fact, the 6th largest exporter of textile and apparels in the world. And of course, a lot to US and to Europe. And what has happened as a result of this tariff, this is data just now released about 4 or 5 days ago, is that in fact there has been a degrowth. That means there's a falling of apparel exports to the extent of about 20%, which is a really, really very high amount. This impacts women very much more because the apparel sector and the entire garment and in fact textile sector, which is primarily informal, is very heavily feminized. About 2/3 of the apparel workforce in India is female, few employed in the formal sector, the majority in the informal sector, whether as daily workers, home-based, piece-rated, etc. India's experience, of course, as we already know, has had the highest tariffs. And this I want to relate to the broader macroeconomic context of a very weak negotiating trade policy. I think this is something which just didn't take women and didn't take workers and the citizens of the country into account. The 50% tariff, which is there, actually increased production cost by about 30 to 35%. And because we face much less tariffs in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Of course, a large number of closures, not only directly, but also indirectly, in terms of, say, just as an illustration of Tirupur, which is one of the main centers, and I think which has been studied in the report which has been presented, that this town accounts for 1/3 of India's textile exports and 90% of cotton knitwear. So it's really, in a way, the center of production in India. There are approximately about 2,500 knitwear units and 70% have been affected. 20% shut down absolutely totally overnight and 50% reduced operations. This is, of course, direct. There are also indirect impacts of dyeing units, transport services, button suppliers, etc., etc. Job losses, reduction in shifts, which has already been pointed out, wage reductions by more than 50% of those workers who were still left. And this, I must say here, the employers seem to have used the camouflage of tariffs to reduce or increase the imbalance which already exists between capital and labor. Because if the costs increased by about 30 to 35%, the wages fell by 50%. Also, of course, the issues of overtime, very important, the shifting of production to smaller informal enterprises and primarily to home-based units where women are significantly much more. And being peace rated, this leads to a huge level of what I call intensification of self-exploitation. Because the more you produce, the more you're going to earn in whichever minimal way that calculation may be made. So, in fact, what you have, we have this labor continuum of paid and unpaid work, which we talk about. And here I'd like to add the issue of underpaid work, which we really don't talk about. So, this continuum, which expanded and deepened and got reinforced at very, very strong levels, each one interacting much more strongly with the other. So therefore, it's of course an increase in unpaid work and decrease in paid work, and underpaid work increasing much more. And this leads to not, I would not even say a double burden, I would say triple burden, because of the lack of state support in knowing in terms of what is really happening at the broader level in the garment sector, but there was absolutely no support which was given to the workers at all. Of course, increasing debt, which has already been pointed out. And this is primarily to cover just the daily essentials. I mean, the impact on education, I think, and health is something which we also need to go, because the lower the income, the lower the expenditure on education and on health. And of course, women and girls are going to suffer much more where this is concerned. And this issue of death, I think, we link to women's role in society in terms of them being responsible primarily for consumption and maintenance of the household. There is also, I think, all these elements combined to, Nagratna has already pointed out some of them, how it impacts the empowerment of the economic decisions within the household and the decision making within the household, the kinds of economic violence which occurs, but also a huge increase in gender-based sexual harassment and violence. And this is, I think, the third event which we have faced in the last 10 years, exactly 10 years. One came, the first one to the process of demonetization. So you had in a country which is 1/3 of migrants and 92% informal sector, you had a massive increase. I've written about this in several places and brought out books about this, that how the first thing which does to be able to even get employment, that women have to submit themselves, for to sexual harassment and to violence. And the saddest part and the most difficult part to accept, that this is really quite normalized, it is internalized. There's no condemnation in terms of the increase that, that woman is loose and therefore she's getting a job, etc., etc. It's understood that you, to get a job and to retain a job, you have to, submit yourself to various, I don't know what term to use, not indignities, but exploitation. There's no other word for that. Second came, of course, the pandemic and that long walk home, where again reverse migration, again migrants facing much more and women facing much more problematic situations. And then comes a third shock, which is the tariffs. And this is across regions. It's not only in the 3 regions which have been pointed out. Now, within this, I would also like to say that simultaneously what has happened, and this is from the 1st of April, which is just, barely 4 weeks ago today, is the implementation, the withdrawal, of course, of all the labor laws, which trade unions have struggled for a century and which are enshrined in the Constitution of India, have been withdrawn. And there are 4 labor codes which have come forth. Now, these labor codes, I'm not going into the details of the labor codes, but just to say 2 aspects. One is the labor code on occupational safety and health and working conditions. This, of course, it's increased the threshold that you, instead of 10 workers who have to have these standard safety measures, etc., occupational hazards should be controlled, working conditions should improve, that the threshold has been doubled. So it's 20 workers, it's 100 workers, it's 300 workers. But we know women and workers in the apparel in particular work primarily in the informal sector. So it's not going to benefit. In fact, it takes away whatever benefits have been struggled for a very long period of time. Second is, and we always hope that unionization increases, but the Labor Code 4, which is on industrial relations, makes it very difficult for unionization. In fact, there is now many constraints. Many areas have been declared as, essential services, where the workers cannot go on strike. The representation of women in boards, including the issues, of course, of sexual harassment, have been removed almost totally. Women who were on boards of working conditions and various other kinds of employment opportunities to increase paid employment, they have been reduced. They formed at least half of all the boards, but they have been reduced to about, I think, not even 1/3, 30%. And also not a single trade union representative on many of these boards which are there. So I really, despair about how we are going to deal with this particular kind of situation. What gives hope, I think, is something which AFWA has done, along with local leaders like Nagaratna and various other organizations, is the Dindikul Agreement in 2022. And this I found really quite fascinating and very, very doable across regions and across maybe even countries. Because what this did, there are 4 basic elements. There are many elements of this, but I'm just talking of the 4 elements. One, that it is worker driven, that every factory has a shop floor monitor, that is a woman who is trained to deal with issues of gender-based violence and to address this. Now, whether this operates in reality or not, in quotes, without fear of retaliation. Okay, that is something I think which we really have to check. Second is the issue of accountability. So if one brand reneges or breaches the obligations or the agreement which has been signed, then other brands are obligated to impose business constraints and the consequences which are there of breaching the contract. The scope covers a huge amount. It covers the entire workplace, production lines, transport, workers' hostels. Remember, these are a large number of migrant workers, and many of them are single women. And therefore, I really think we should focus a little more on how the single women have been done in terms of the kind of research which we do. And the success has been really quite remarkable. And that in 1 year alone, that is in 2023, after it was signed, 3/4 of the cases of gender-based violence and sexual harassment were dealt with successfully. Okay, let's put it that way. And this was done within a short period of about 2 weeks. Struggles continue. We know in Delhi, in the NRC region or in the Noida region, the workers went on strike. Many of them were arrested. Huge amount of repression on them. Many of them are still in jail. And but yet the employers were forced, because the issues of production and various other aspects, to increase the wages, maybe by very little, but at least to increase to some extent, still not equaling the minimum wages which are legally mandated. Also, I think very recently, 17th of March, as far as I remember, right now, there has been in Tirupur a wage increase of about 1/3, spread over 4 years of time. So I think we can take inspiration from what the Noida workers are doing, from what the Tirupur, Tamil Nadu workers are doing, and a lot from various other struggles which are taking place are not really talked about. So I'll stop here. There's a lot more to say, but I think 10 minutes I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diwan, and for those insightful reflections and for bringing such an important gender perspective to this discussion. I now invite Comrade R. Karumaran, National Secretary of the Center of Indian Trade Unions, CITU. He is a leading trade union leader in India known for his work in organizing transport workers and advocating for labor rights, particularly around labor law reforms, social security, including pensions. He has also represented India at the 2022 International Labour Conference. He will speak about why trade policy must be seen as a core trade union issue and the role unions need to play in responding to these shifts. Over to you, Comrade.
Yes, comrade, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you, to share my observation. But anyhow, it is a very important topic that you have taken. Yes, it is more relevant also. To be very honest, as a trade union activist since long, for a decade, any trade policy, even the sovereign parliament has no role at all. Expecting trade union to play such a role, I think it is to be a person working at the national capitals as a national secretary at a national headquarter, an important class trade union like a CITU. With our humbleness, I am saying, though I represented all of the policy debate in the labor law codification. Personally, I have been involving all along since 2020, when the code on wages, even before that also, attending the parliamentary standing committee and all tripartite consultation everywhere, where the policy, that too a trade policy. There is no, even our parliament has no binding Indian parliament, as far as I'm saying. Those may be from some other country. There are some sort of thing that I heard from European parliament, some European countries. They are having some constitutional mechanism to come to the parliament, where they are as a stakeholder. Never in Indian context, trade union being consulted on any trade policy. Okay, it is very clear. Or otherwise, to influence the trade policy, the trade unions, its role, you cannot imagine. Such a transformative role it has to take. So it's such a radicalization, a long way to go to influence. Unless otherwise you are having a say in the government, you are not, unless otherwise you are having any, though I am having a say in the government, my people are in the parliament, where we can claim so sometime. As a trade union, such a culture is not there. With capitalism, which is making everything upside down, so it is a different thing. That is why, as far as influencing the trade policy, we have a limited scope. We can debate this. Number one. Number two, all the disruption in the supply chain, all the understanding the political economy of the disruption and the supply chain. And that is a disruption. For a disruption, any natural calamity in globally, even all Payment of Wages Act, it is very clear. If there is something beyond the worker condition happen, worker not accountable for any wage reduction. That it is a natural justice that is prevalent in globally. So disruption is a disruption. Even if you calculate the disruption of American tariff, actual how much the percentage, it is a very minimal. Taking the advantage of the global recession is going on, because Indian product, apparel product, we cannot sold in the European or American market. Because everywhere, due to the crisis of the capitalism, the shrinking. Those who are not, all apparel goods being the ordinary below middle class segment, it be exported, not to the elite people. Already that market saturated. Where we are supplying a country like India or South Asian country, supplying to such a consumer. Basically, they lost their income. That is the crisis of the capitalism, which has dented already. Then the disruption also taken. So for in contextualizing everything in the terms of the disruption alone, tariff, now it has gone. Then whether Tripura worker will survive? No. At that time, having the agreement copy with me. That's a 13. March 13 agreement. Your details are with me. It is not at all a wage. We cannot claim this, though we signed. We got a little bit of, it has nothing to do with this ongoing worker struggle, either in central India as well as in the North India, where in Tirupur it is a different mechanism where they arrived some sort of thing. So my humble suggestion is, you see, all the sophisticated languages, where is the supply chain? The term which is a unit. Legally, it has to be a unit where worker engaging, there must be a legal mechanism. That is going to be nullified. They are going to make it invisible, the employer-employee relations. Then we are talking about the brand where an ordinary worker from Dindukal can, that you are citing as a model of the Dindukal agreement. I do work among the Dindukal textile worker. I was the General Secretary of the Tamil Nadu Textile Worker Federation for more than a decade. So I think it is my point is, for the fixation of the wage or for employing the worker, even the national law should have its own sovereignty in all sphere of production, where it is there. Now unless we are bringing all these things into the debate, one day disruption, vis-a-vis your working condition, disruption, global disruption, trade disruption. It is a capitalistic disruption. Capitalistic disruption is a prolonging for a decade, and where it will make definitely. On the pretext they cannot do. Even every country, whatever them, even tsunami taking place, you cannot reduce your wage. Either production take place or not, beyond the workers' control. How they got the temerity to do all this, to violate everything in the law. That is going on in India now. So now the labor law codification also did whatever the protective elements in the existing law, now they're done away with. Now they are at a liberty to do anything what they want. They can prolong working hour. They can pay, because you cannot imagine how the government advocated the floor level wage also. Floor level wage, it has no scientific basis at all. Minimum wage, less than minimum wage, nobody. You cannot run any business without paying the minimum wage. That was a Supreme Court judgment in India, Indian Apex Court judgment. Now, below minimum wage, government invented another one, this floor level wage also. So now such a opening, such a floodgate being opened, the worker are being put at the altar of the exploitation without any check and balance. So in that context, that is the area, that it is the character of the current structure of the capitalism, both in the, that is why I'm saying the production, the global supply chain, the so-called supply chain. What does it mean, supply chain? What is the political economic supply chain? It is a mechanism for ruthless exploitation. Where in the name of all these things are now going on. So I think we have to revisit the entire system, within which we cannot. There is so many global agreement is there. With in Europe, the ILO bringing so many agreement with such a multinational company, MNC is having such a agreement. Nobody is now listening. We are having a union in the all MNCs in India, in manufacturing area also. Even Tripura also, we are having our active union, CIT union. So I think here, instead of focusing on the disruption, now it will take place. As capitalism prone to create such a disruption, in order to withstand all these things, we should have our own a nation-specific inbuilt mechanism. That definitely, in terms of wage, in terms of working condition, in terms of other social security net, that will only the way to protect the worker interest. I think in that way we ought to think, we ought to build some. That is why all Central Indian Trade Union, we are fighting for at least you convene the such a policy, any labor policy decision, a discussion, Indian Labor Conference. None. It is apex body. It was a very good institution that was created by Dr. Ambedkar even during the Second World War time. That was done away with now after Modi came to power. And now we are longing, where we can discuss. Minister called us. I represented CITU. When Minister called us, it's a tripartite meeting. We collectively we petitioned him. We begged virtually with the minister, labor minister. You call because we have more. Catastrophic changes is taking place in the structure of the employment relation, employer and employee. So it has to be discussed in the tripartite forum. One institutionalized forum is there. Nobody is respecting. Accordingly, now you see the law is Indian law, labor law codification is going on. It was passed without any opposition in the parliament. Code on wages, everybody except the left, everybody joined in the code on wages. We left, myself, our leader, General Secretary, Alamaram Karim proposed the amendment. Except Indian left, everybody supported code on wages. Then later, without opposition, it was. So the ecosystem created for such a ruthless exploitation in India, such a political consensus. Unless we break the political consensus in favor of the worker, the consensus for a neoliberal such a tendency they have created. So I think in that sense, trade union has got much more role in organizing at a shop floor, in motivating them, understanding their wage, how it is related. You see the North Indian worker strike. It is connected to the global war, that American war on Iran. American war on Iran, it is not a arrogance of the Trump. How a worker can understand? He is losing his wage due to the hike of cylinder or some other thing. So everything connected. So we have to all trade union has got a much more role while organizing, understanding the dynamics of the capitalism and its political representative in a given country, then mobilizing the worker. This is my idea. We Central Trade Union accordingly. We are collectively in India. We are working in such a way. You people also doing that. I came to know that you are taking effort, whatever the effort for the cause of the worker, and to make them a collective, because such a collectivism, organizing the union, whoever may be, unionless, non-union, no union free zone. They want to make it like that is the labor code and everything they are attempting to show. So my humble submission is, anyhow, given a context of tariff disruption, such a weaponization of the tariff, so many such a weaponization government is taking, or given all the capitalist countries that they are taking, we ought to specifically study and respond. Definitely trade union has got some role, but to change everything, it is a different trajectory. Accordingly, we ought to move. That is my submission. Thank you for being with you and hearing my submission also. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Karimalayan, for that powerful perspective and for highlighting why trade policy is a critical issue for the labor movement. To bring in a regional perspective from South Asia, I invite Mohammad Abdul Hussain, a veteran labor leader and freedom fighter from Bangladesh. He currently serves as president of the Textile Garment Workers Federation and has decades of experience organizing workers across sectors, including garment, informal, domestic, and migrant workers. He is also the co-chair of Asia Brand Bargaining Group of AFWA Bangladesh. He will reflect on how these trade shifts are playing out across South Asia and the shared challenges workers are facing. Over to you, Comrade.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, we can
Do
hear
you
you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Today is 29 April. After one day, May Day. May Day, Working Class International Solidarity Day. So on behalf of Bangladesh working class, express our revolutionary greetings to all of you. So thank you so much. I come to my topics. Dear comrades and sister friends, I come to conversation from Bangladesh where a garments industry is not just an economic sector, it is the backbone of the million working class families. And today, the backbone of understanding. We are being told the global trade, shifting and traffic changes, the markets are adjusting. But for workers is not above the trade. This is the whether we have work tomorrow, whether wage come to time, and whether families can survive. In 2025, tariff tension escalated. We saw the deeply worried the pattern emerge. US buyers did not only demand price cut, they push and delay productions itself. In Bangladesh, several major buyers asked the supplies to hold their bags and samples while they waited for clarify the on tariffs. Thing that they are mean in practice. Factories had already produced goods, work, and workers had already completed their work, but shipment were suddenly put on hold. Payment were delayed and order became uncertain. And once again, the risk was pushed onto supply and then onto work. At the same time, buyer increased pressure the suppliers. Many were asked the absurd traffic-related cost, while others faced the demand and further price reduction. Supplies were often left to no real choice either take the losses and losing their further orders. This is not the isolated decide. It is related abroad the pattern during the tariff period, where brand proposed to uncertainty to shifting financial risks down to supply certain. And this is actually that border research has down. Across South Asia brands and responding the tariff changes the consequent why. They protect their margins and by the pushing cost down it and supplies are requisite, workers are speculous and even more. But where the important is, this is not the happening only in Bangladesh. Across India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, we are the same pattern. Order being put on hold, buyer shifting, sourcing, supplier absorbing cost, working facing instability. This is tells as clearly. We are not dealing with isolated incident. We are dealing regional systems of risk transfer. Brands are also constantly adjusting where they source from. Today, Bangladesh, tomorrow, India, next month, other country. These decisions are driven by cost, not by the workers' well-being. And this is third category, dangerous circle. Workers are made complete across the border. We are told, accept longer wage or other will move, stay silent, or production will shift. This is how to raise the bottom is maintained. Our demand must be clear. Brand must not delay on halt order without responsibility from workers. They must not force suppliers to absorb tariff cost. They must ensure paying the over's living wages. They must maintain stable sourcing relationship, and they must engage with trade union transparently. At the same time, government also have responsibility. Trade union cannot ignore labor relatives. If tariffs generated revenue, the revenue must support workers and also the social protection and wage ability. But my conclusion remark is Bangladesh is among the countries adversely affected by the trade and tariff politics of Europe and United States. As advanced capitalist economy, these countries often impose such as tariff measures and developing nations with significantly influence trade flowers and investment opportunities and overall economic growth. These politics place additional pressure on countries like Bangladesh, particularly terms of market access of opportunities. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, comrade. And Now, I would like to introduce our next panelist from Southeast Asia. We have Yang Safon. She is the president of the Cambodian Alliance of Trade Unions and has over 20 years of experience advocating for garment and footwear workers. She has been instrumental in securing benefits beyond legal requirements, short-term to permanent contracts, and enhancing workplace health and safety conditions. She'll speak about how global supply chains create competition across countries and why cross-border labor solidarity is critical at this moment. Over to you, Safon.
ចាជាដំបូងសូមគោរពនិង
First
សូ
of
មជំរា
all,
បសួរ
my respect
ដល់បងប្អូន
to
វាគ្មិនទាំង
comrades,
អស់ដែលមានវត្តមាន
sisters,
ខ្ញុំថ្នាក់សូម
brothers,
ជំរាបសួរទៅដល់បងប្អូន
and
អស់គ្នាដែលមានវត្ត
everyone,
មាននៅក្នុងការប្រជុំនៅទាំងអស់គ្នា
all
ជាទីគោរព
participants
ចឹងណា
in the webinar today.
ពីខ្ញុំរួមទាំងបងប្អូនមិត្តរួមការងារនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជា
I
សូម
bring you
គោរព
greetings,
អរគុណទៅ
yeah,
ដល់
from
បង
Southeast
ប្អូនទាំងពីរ
Asia.
ដែលបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យខ្ញុំ
Thanks very
តំណាង
much
ឲ្យ
for
ប្រជាជនប
allowing
រោ
me
ចិត្តក្នុងប្រទេស
to
កម្ពុជា
represent
ឬក៏ក្នុង
Cambodian
មនសិនហ្នឹង
workers
បា
as
នមាន
well
កិច្ច
as
ប្រជុំមួយលើកឡើង
workers in the
ពាក់ព័ន្ធនៅក្នុង
Asia
ស្ថានភាព
region
របស់កម្មករ
to
និយោជិត
share
ដែល
about
មាន
the
បាន
condition
រាប់
of
ម៉ឺនរាប់សែន
millions
នាក់នៅ
of
ក្នុង
garment
ប្រទេសនៅក្នុង
workers
បរណស៊ី
in
ទាំងនេះ ដែល
our
កំពុង
region
តែពុះពៀធ្វើ
who
ការងារយ៉ាង
continue
ជិតស្និទ្ធ ស្វឹក
to
ស្វាញបន្តផលិតទំនិញសម្រាប់
struggle
ឲ្យក្រុមហ៊ុ
to
នម៉ាកយីហោ
work
ធំៗ ប៉ុន្តែ
in order to produce for global
ពួក
brand.
គាត់នៅតែ
Yet
មាន ទុក្ខលំ
the
បាក
workers
ក្រុម
themselves
កម្មករនិយោជិតទាំងនោះហ្នឹងមិនទាន់
face
ទទួល
a lot of
បានការ
suffering
ទទួលខុសត្រូវទទួលបានការគិ
and
តគូរការឲ្យ
they
តម្លៃគ្រប់
have
គ្រា
not
ន់ ដែល
been
ពួកគាត់រង
valued
ផលប៉ះពាល់
enough
ទៅដល់ជីវភាព រស់
and
នៅប្រកបដោយ
their
សេរីភាពជាដើម
livelihood is greatly
រាជរដ្ឋា
impacted.
ភិបាលនិងអ្នកជំនាញសេដ្ឋកិច្ច
The
និយាយអំពី គោលនយោបាយ
government
ក្នុង
and
នៃក្នុងទំនិញ
economists
ខ្លាំង
they
មែនទែន
talk
ដូចជា
about
ពាក់ព័
tariff
ន្ធជាមួយនឹង
in
ការ
a very broad
អឺ
sense. They talk
ទៅនឹង
in
គោលនយោបាយ
terms
ពាណិជ្ជកម្ម
of
ឬ
trade
គោលនយោ
policy.
បាយ
They talk
រឿង
in
សេដ្ឋ
terms
កិច្ចជា
of
ដើម ប៉ុន្តែសម្
geopolitics
រាប់កម្មករនិយោ
about
ជិតពន្ធមានន័យថា
economy or
គោ
national
លគឺមាន
interest.
ការនាំមកពីផលប៉ះ
However,
ពាល់
for
ដល់ជីវ
workers,
ភាពរស់នៅរបស់កម្មករនិ
tariff
យោជិត
is about
ក៏ដូច
something
ជានាំ
else.
ឲ្យមាន
It
ការ
is
បាត់
about
បង់
job
ការងារ
loss,
ការកាត់បន្ថ
about
យនៃប្រាក់
wage
ឈ្នួ
cut.
លនៃ
It is
ជីវភាព
about
រស់នៅ
life
កាន់តែ
pushed
មិនមាន
deeper
សុវត្ថិ
into
ភាពនិងគ្មានស្ថិរ
insecurity.
ភាពប្រឈមទៅនឹងការលំបាកផ្នែកសេដ្ឋកិច្ច
And
កាន់តែ
we
ខ្លាំង
face
មិន
even
មែនត្រឹមតែ
more
មានការប្រកួតប្រ
economic
ជែងផ្នែកពាណិជ្ជកម្មប៉ុណ្ណោះទេ
difficulties.
ចឹងណា
So it is not only just about
ប៉ុន្តែវា
trade
ជាការផ្ទេរហានិភ័យ
competitiveness,
ការងារទៅ
and
លើ
this is
កម្ម
a
ករនិយោជិតជាប្រចាំ
transfer of
ផុសតាង ផ្នែកមិញ
responsibility
ព្រម
to the
ទាំងការផលិ
workers
តនៅ
in
កា
a
រសិក្សាស្រាវជ្រា
systematic
វ
manner.
បន្ទាន់របស់ AFWA នៅ
Recent
សហរដ្ឋ
evidence, including
នៅប្រទេសឥណ្ឌា
findings from
និងរ
AFWA
បាយការណ៍របស់មជ្ឈ
in
មណ្ឌលទូត
India
ពិសិដ្ឋភាព Business and Human Rights ដែល
and
បាន
a
គូសបញ្ជាក់អំពី
study
បញ្ហា
by
អឺ
Business and Human Rights
ដែលបានកើត
institutions.
ដែល
They
ដែល
mention,
ដែលបាន
yeah,
កើតមានពុះពៀ
they
នៅក្នុងការ
confirm
ត
what
ស៊ូ
we already know
គ្រប់
from
គ្រង
our
ជីវភាព
daily
រស់នៅប្រចាំថ្ងៃ
struggles,
របស់ពួក
which
គាត់
means that when
នៅ
costs
ពេលដែលពួកគាត់
increase,
ចំណាយកាន់តែច្រើន
brand do not
អឺ
absorb
ចំណាយកាន់
such
តែកើន
costs.
ឡើងម៉ាកយីហោមិនទទួលខុសត្រូវនៅក្នុងការចំណាយបន្ថែមសម្រាប់កម្មករនិយោជិតនោះ
So
ទេ
there is no
ពួកគេដាក់បន្
additional
ទុកការ
payment
ចំណាយ
for
ទៅ
the
លើ
workers on
ក្រុមហ៊ុន
that.
ផ្គត់ផ្គង់
But
ហើយនៅទីបំផុត
instead,
បន្ទុកទាំងអស់
the
ហ្នឹងគឺធ្លាក់ទៅ
brand
ដល់
will
កម្មករ
push
និយោជិត
such costs
ជាមួយ
down
គ្នានេះដែរ
to the suppliers,
គោលនយោ
who
បាយ
will
ទាំង
then
ទាំងនោះ
push
ក៏
it
អាច
further
បង្ក
to
ឲ្យ
the
មានវិបត្តិ
workers, and
ដូចជា
workers
សម័យ
pay
2017
the
ដែល
price.
មានការបញ្ឈប់ពីការងារជាច្រើន
And at the same time,
លួចកេញញ៉ាំ
the
ប្រាក់ឈ្នួ
tariff
ល ការ
policy
បិទ
is
សហគ្រាសដោយមិនមានការ
triggering
ទទួលខុសត្រូវជាដើ
a
ម
crisis like during
បង
COVID-19
ប្អូ
period,
នទាំងអស់គ្នា
marked
ជា
by
ទីគោរព
mass
ខ្ញុំសូម
layoff,
លើក
wage
ឡើង
theft, and factory
ថា
closure.
នេះមិនមែនជាវិបត្តិថ្មីទេ
So
វា
allow me
ជារំ
to
លង
say
ដែលពួក
that
យើងឆ្លងកាត់រួចមក
this
ហើយ
is not a
វា
new
ជាវិបត្តិ
crisis.
សកល
This is a familiar
មិន
pattern.
ថាជាជំងឺរីករាល
Every
ដាលនៃ
global
វិបត្តិ
shock,
សេដ្ឋកិច្ច
whether it is
ឬ
pandemic,
ហើ
an
យ
economic
នេះគឺជាទុន
crisis, and now
តែង
it's
តែ
about
ដើរ
tariff.
លំនាំ
These
រវាងខ្លួនគ្នា
follows the same script.
ការបញ្ជាទិញត្រូវបានលុបចោលឬក៏
Orders
បន្
are
ថយ
cancelled or
តម្លៃត្រូវ
reduced.
បាន កាត់ដោយ
Price
គ្មាន
are
ការ
cut
ចរចា
without negotiation.
ការផលិតត្រូវបាន
Production
ផ្លាស់ប្ដូរទៅ
shift
ទៅ
across
ពីខាងពីប្រទេស
borders,
មួយទៅប្រទេសមួយផ្សេងទៀត ហើយ
and
កម្មករនិយោជិត
workers are left to absorb the
ត្រូវ
shock.
បានទទួលបន្ទុកទាំងអស់នេះមិនមែនជារឿងចៃដន្យទេ
And this is not
វា
an
ជាស
accident.
មិទ្ធផលនៃ
This
ប្រព័ន្ធខ្សែចម្ពោះ
is the
បេះដូង
result
ដែលនាំ
of a
គ្រប់
brand-driven
គ្រង
supply
ដោយ
chain
ក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាក
model
យីហោដែល
that
ផ្ដល់អាទិភាព
prioritize
ទៅលើ
profit
ប្រាក់ចំណេញពី
over
ជាងការគោរ
people
ពសិទ្ធិមនុស្ស
and
ហើយ
human
ប្រព័ន្ធ
rights.
ទាំងនេះគឺផ្អែកទៅ
And
លើ
this
រឿង
model depends on
មួយ
something
ដែល
very
គេចាត់ចែង
dangerous
ព្រោះការប្រកួតប្រជែង
because
រវាងប្រទេស
competition
រវាង
between
ប្រទេសយើងនិងប្រទេសជើង
our
អញ្ចឹងណា
countries. Yeah.
នៅក្នុងតំបន់អាស៊ីយើង
So
ឃើ
in
ញ
Southeast
បញ្
Asia,
ហាទាំងនេះ
we
យ៉ាងច្បាស់
see this clearly.
ការបញ្ជាទិញខ្លះពីប្រទេសមួយទៅ
Orders
ប្រទេសមួយ
move
គឺ
from
កម្ពុជា
one
ទៅវៀត
country
ណា
to
ម ពី
another, like
ឥ
from
ណ្ឌូ
Cambodia to
ទៅ
Vietnam,
បដិស
like from
អាស្រ័យនឹង
Indonesia,
និពន្ធ
based
ថា
on
តើ
the
កម្ម
cost,
ករធ្វើការងារ
tariff, and
បត់
how
បែនយ៉ាង
flexible workers
យ៉ាងខ្លាំង
can
ទៅ
be
លើ
made.
ចំណុចទាំងអស់ហ្នឹង នេះបង្កើត
This
បានជា
creates
ការប្រកួតប្រ
what
ជែ
we
ង
call
បន្ទាប់ពីប្រាក់ឈ្នួល
and
ការ
in
ប្រកួត
this
ប្រជែង
race,
កម្មករយុត្តិ
no
គឺកម្មករ
worker
យុត្តិនៅធ្វើការ
wins.
ងារដូច
Yeah.
ពីមុន ហើយនៅក្នុងការប្រណាំងប្រជែងនេះ គឺគ្មានកម្មករណាម្នាក់ឈ្នះនោះទេ សម្ព័ន្ធប្រាក់ឈ្នួលអាស៊ី បាន
In
បញ្ជាក់យ៉ាងច្បាស់
in this
ពាក់ព័ន្ធ
race,
នៅក្នុង
as
ការ
we
ដាក់
can
សម្ពាធ
see
ទៅលើកម្មករ
through
ជា
the
ពិសេស
study
ត្រូវ
by
បង្ខំ
Asia
គេ
Flowage
ធ្លាក់
Alliance,
ចូលទៅក្នុងភាព
and
ក្រី
it
ក្រ
has
ខ្លាំង
rightly pointed out
គ្មាន
that
ការ
the
ងារ
system
ធ្វើ
push
និង
workers,
ការ
especially women,
រកបំ
into
ពាន និង
deepening
ការបន្តតម្លៃ
poverty and
ការធ្វើការ
unemployment and heightened vulnerability
លើកនេះ
to
យើងត្រូវ
exploitation and gender-based
ដូ
violence.
ច្នេះ យើងត្រូវតែសួរថា តើនរណា
So
ទទួល
we
បានអ
must
ត្ថប្រ
ask
យោជន៍ ពី
who
ការប្រកួតប្រជែ
benefit
ង
from
នេះ
this competition?
មិនមែនកម្មករមិនមែន
Not the
ហើយ
workers,
ក៏មិនមែន
not
អ្នក
the
លក់ផង
union,
ដែរ
and not
មាន
even
តែ
the
ក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាក
suppliers.
យីហោតែ
It
ប៉ុណ្ណោះ
is only the brand.
ហើយ
Here,
នេះខ្ញុំចង់
allow
បញ្
me
ជាក់
to
នៅសកលភាពមួយទៀត
emphasize
ថាហេតុនេះហើយ
that
បានជា ការឆ្លើយតប
for
របស់
this
យើង
reason,
មិនអាចនៅក្នុងកម្រិត
our
ជាតិ
response
នោះទេ
cannot remain at the
ពីព្រោះ
national
បញ្
level
ហាមិនមែនជា
because the
បញ្ហា
problem
នៅក្នុង
is
កម្រិត
not
ប្រទេសទេ
a
វា
problem
ជា
that
បញ្ហានៅ
happened
ក្នុង
at
កម្
the
រិត
national
តំបន់
level.
ក៏ដូចជាស
It
កល
is the
ហើយយើង
problem
ឆ្លើយ
at
ត
the
ប
regional and
តា
global
មពិភ
level.
ប្រទេស
So
មួយ
if
មួយ
we
ប្រទេស
respond
ម៉ាកយីហោនឹងបន្ត
by
នៅក្នុង
country,
ការបំបែកគ្នា
brands will continue to divide
តែ
us.
បើយើង
But if
បើប្រាក់ឈ្នួលកើនឡើងនៅប្រទេស
so
មួយ
if
ការ
wage
ផលិតត្រូវ
rise
ផ្លាស់
in
ប្ដូ
one
រទៅ
country,
ប្រទេសមួយ
production
ផ្សេងទៀត
will be moved to
បើ
another
កម្មករ
country.
ចងក្រងនៅកន្លែ
If
ងមួយ
workers
ការបង្ក្រាប
organize in one
និងការ
place,
កើនឡើង
repression
នៅ
will
ការប្រកួតប្រជែង
intensify
នៅកន្លែងផ្សេងនឹង
elsewhere.
កើនឡើងផ្សេងកើនឡើងទៀត នេះគឺជាបញ្ហា
This
ដែល
is
ក្លាយ
the
ជា
structural
សម្ពាធដែលយើង
reality
កំពុង
we
តែ
are
ប្រឈម
facing.
សព្វថ្ងៃ ហេតុនេះហើយយើង
And
ត្រូវតែ
that
ផ្លាស់
is
ប្ដូរ
why we
ការ
must
ប្រកួតប្រជែង
change.
ទៅនឹង
We
ការ
must
បង្កើត
shift
បង្កើ
from
ននៃការសាម
competition
គ្គីភាពគ្នា
to
ការ
increase
សាមគ្គីភាព
solidarity.
មិនមែនគ្រាន់តែ
Solidarity
ជា
is
ស្លោកទេ
not
ទេ
just
វា
a
ជា
slogan,
យុ
it
ទ្ធ
is
សា
a
ស្ត្រមួយ
strategy.
សំខាន់ ហើយទាំងអស់គ្នាត្រូវការចូលរួមទាំងអស់គ្នា
First,
ជា
yeah,
ដំបូងយើងត្រូវបង្កើត
we must
កិច្ចស
build
ន្ទនា រ
cross-border
វាង
coordination.
រវាងតាមបណ្ដាប្រទេសផ្សេងៗ យើងត្រូវចែករំលែកព័ត៌មាន
We
រវាង
need
ប្រ
to
ទេស អំ
share
ពីការ
information across
កាត់
countries
ថ្លៃ
on
ការ
price
ផ្លាស់
cut,
ប្ដូរការបញ្ជាទិញ
order
ការរំ
shift,
លោភបំពាន
and
វិធីសាស្ត្រ
labor
ការងារ
violations.
ព្រោះ
បង
ថា
សូមសង្ខេបហ្នឹងមកអាច
ចា ព្រោះ
conclude ដោយសារ
ព្រោះ
យើងអស់ម៉ោង
ចា ព្រោះម៉ាកយីហោនឹង ហើយយើងត្រូវតែ
And we
ធ្វើដូច
need
គ្នា
to
ខ្ញុំគិតថា
work,
ចំណុចទី
yeah,
2
we
គឺយើ
need
ង
to align
ទា
our
មទារ
demands.
ឲ្យ
Secondly, we need to
យើងមានការ
demand
អនុញ្ញាតឲ្យក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាក
um,
មិនអាចឲ្យអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាកយីហោ
we
ហ្នឹងគាត់ជំរុញ
secondly
ភាព
we
ខុស
should
គ្នា
not
រវាងប្រទេសនិងប្រទេសមួយអញ្ចឹង
allow
ណា
the brand to
ទី 3 គឺ
make
យើងត្រូវ
profit
ពង្រឹង
from the
ពង្រីក
difference
ការចរ
from
ចានៅ
one
ក្នុងកម្រិ
country
ត
to
ថ្នាក់ដឹកនាំ
another.
ថ្នាក់សកល ដើម្បី
Thirdly,
ធ្វើ
we
យ៉ាង
need
ណា
to
ឲ្យមាន
strengthen
ការមានកិត្តិយសខ្ពស់
collaboration
ឲ្យម៉ាកយីហោមានការទទួល
and
ខុសត្រូវ
make sure
ហើយ
that
ខ្ញុំគិតថាទី 4
brand
គឺ
are
យើងត្រូវ
responsible.
តែធ្វើឲ្យម៉ាកយីហោហ្នឹង
And
គឺទទួលបាន
another
ខុសត្រូវ
point, we need
ចំពោះពួកយើងទាំង
to
អស់គ្នាមិនមែន
make
ជា
brand
ជា
responsible
រួម
for all of us
ហើយ
collectively.
ជាចុងក្រោយខ្ញុំគិតថា
And lastly, I
យើង
think
ត្រូវធានា
that
ឲ្យមាន
we
យុត្តិ
need to
ធម៌សម្រាប់
ensure
កម្មករយុត្តិឲ្យគាត់ទទួលបាន
fairness
សមរម្យ
for workers to receive decent wage and long-term sustainability for workers.
អញ្ចឹងខ្ញុំគិតថាជាចុងក្រោយ
So
គឺ
in conclusion, I just would like to request for I appeal for the end of division and we should work together in order to ensure decent livelihood, transforming exploitation to respect for human rights and decent life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Safwan, for those valuable insights and for highlighting the importance of cross-border labor solidarity in responding to these challenges. To bring all these perspectives together, I now invite Ashin Roy, International Secretary at Asia Floorwage Alliance and President of Mil Mazdoor Panchayat Union India. He is a veteran labor rights activist with over 4 decades of experience in India's workers' movement. He has been deeply involved in trade union field building and shaping many initiatives to link the labor and social movement. He will help us synthesize today's discussion and reflect on the way forward for collective labor action. Over to you, Ashin.
Thanks, Aparna. It's an insightful comments and discussion that has happened with Dr. Ritu Diwan and Karuna Malayam, speaking very emphatically on the nature of crisis that we are all engulfed in. I will just focus on few of the frameworks through which the trade union can respond to this situation and look at some of the possibilities that exist. And in that context, take up the question that has also come in in the question and in the question sections. First, let us say as a union, the first response is always naturally with the supplier company, the company where we are involved. And I think what Harris's, the whole Asia Floorwage report shows up is a very interesting thing, is that the first level, and this is very important because, one of the impact that we see is that essentially there's a loss of overtime, which there are two factors that come, or two aspects that should be brought into in this debate. One is the inherent nature of the supplier factories working for 12-hour shift. Essentially, the production capacity, when they are negotiated with the brands, it is assumed that most of these companies will be working on a 12-hour shift. And it is this perspective that allows them to have a flexibility because they know that they can reduce 4 hours if there's a crisis, which is almost 30% of the production capacity. So essentially, Indian suppliers, and I think it is true for most of the global suppliers in Asia, can adjust up to 12, almost to 30% of their production capacity to all the shocks that come from international things before it starts impacting their factory in terms of job losses. But it does impact in a drastic fashion the idea of an income crisis or income loss of the workers, which is what the women workers face so drastically and so important. This is very important, a distinction between an income loss and a job loss. The income loss is severe. That is very clear in the report. That is also very clear from the fact that the recent, as Dr. Ritu Diwan said, that the recent crisis, and also Karuna Nam said, my comrade from C2, that the recent upsurge in the North Indian factories, and one should not forget the focal point of both in Gurgaon and in Noida was the garment factory. In fact, the factories where in many ways some of the unions associated with Asia Floorwage are involved, Modelama, richer industries. And the major crisis was actually how it impacted the overtime. They were very conscious of the fact that they were not getting even the normal overtime rate. But the fact that the overtime loss, if there is a crisis, means that their livelihood crisis, their earning crisis comes into the play. That's a very important. It also revealed the very structural question, which is so important in the global supply chain, that the global supply chain is built on supplier factories, having a regime of 12 hours of job without paying overtime. Now, this is where I think the labor regime, the whole idea of how do we address as a trade union has to first response come in. In fact, the workers have shown more than the trade unions in the NCR region that even without, if the unions don't respond to the situation, if the unions can't cope up with the situation, the workers' revolt is evident, and it is becoming very clear that this will happen in many parts of the world as it goes forward. That is a very important part of it. And that is where we feel that we should push this responsibility. And this is where the Union Asia Pro should bring the idea of the relationship of the suppliers to the brand in terms of what we have already argued again and again. There's a liability. It's so structured. It is so dependent. It is so streamlined in many ways to the way the production is done that one can bring the idea of a joint liability between brands and the supplying companies in order that the unions can respond. And I will take back with what Sofan has said, that we have to begin first making the brands accountable in our own country. That's the first step. So the crisis of the tariff, and this is again, I'm coming of the tariff, is to really respond on a supplier and the brand level. Now, I do want to make a caveat here that even if it was not a punitive tariff, which is what the Trump did in the first instance, inherently, this is an argument that we have been putting, and I think it should be discussed more, that inherently the globalization is coming to an end. And so the nature of a tariff or a trade crisis is emerging in the reality. Not even the geopolitical punitive tariff, but even without that, the idea of a trade crisis is emerging, and we have to respond to this trade crisis because it basically means what is the nature of trade crisis. And I'll look at it only from the point of view of supply chain framework, but that actually has a very interesting phenomena that is emerging. Now let us look at from the Asian point of view. Now let's move from a national level to this crisis in an Asian point of view. Two responses have happened. One is that is intra-Asia competitive framework. It has increased, and every supplier organization and business organization is saying, how should I compete with vis-a-vis Bangladesh? And Indian companies are saying Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Indonesian and Cambodian companies are also talking the same language. So there's an intra-regional or intra-Asia competitiveness that is being induced by this kind of a company. And one of the principles that Asia Pro stood for, that, and this is very important, any trade union response on a regional level has to one that respects disproportionate tariff risks, which destabilizes the production base of the Asian countries, which means it destabilizes the garment workers in the Asian countries shouldn't be allowed. And we have to respond to it, which means we do not allow for this competitiveness to escalate to a point where it starts impacting the production bases and the workers in the Asian region. How do we do it? And this is where the core question comes in. Let's look at this from a point of view of a market access. After what does the tariff crisis show? The tariff crisis, this is very important, tariff crisis showed that once you have an European and Western market, and we are dependent on a market access to the US market, then the US state can impose tariff and can destabilize things. That is one side of it. But let's look at the other side of it, and which is very important, that the West is also become dependent on Asia. I've been saying this for ages, that if Asia does not produce clothes, the whole of Europe and West will go naked. So 60% of the garment is produced in Asian countries. That also brings a dependency of the West on Asia. Now, this is where the idea of Asia responding as Asia, or as garment suppliers in Asia responding as Asian suppliers, is it possible to do that, is a question. And if the suppliers are not willing to take a undermine the competitive risk and do something, if states are not willing to look at it, is it not the responsibility of the unions to propose and see how that can be posed? And this is where I would end and say what my sister Sofan said so eloquently, that the South-South cooperation is in the agenda. And the South-South cooperation is in the agenda in terms of that we can actually, if we cooperate, we can actually propose, let's say, trade policy. And if you have a trade policy that talks about how to impose a counter measure against this, then the South-South cooperation becomes a very important. The regional trade cooperation becomes a reality, and the trade unions can then play within that framework a larger bargaining framework with the brands. So I think what I want to end is that the trade union response has to be also there in, as my other comments have said, along with the political positioning and the political opposite response to all this thing. But the trade unions also have to, a nation level, think about how regional cooperation can be built, how solidarity can be built in South-South trade, and within that framework, how we can make the brands accountable to this destabilizing factor that this kind of a tariff imposition, which even if the punitive framework stops, will still be there in the reality because it's a part of a larger crisis that the neoliberalism is going through. So let's hope so that as this discussion goes forward, we can respond to that in a much more concrete and cogent fashion. Thank you. I look forward to discussing on this in future. Yeah. Thank you, Aparna.
Yeah, thank you, Oshim. I hope all of us are leaving today with a clear understanding that at the heart of every trade decision is a worker, often with no say but facing the consequences. And over the past year, we have been dealing with a mix of crises all at once: rising cost of living, tariffs and trade disruptions, geopolitical tensions, ongoing conflicts and wars. On top of that, climate related shocks and supply chain issues. And these aren't separate, they are all overlapping and feeding into each other. Today, we are here not just to document this reality, but to recognize our role in responding to it. Because this is not only an economic issue, it is fundamentally about dignified work and dignified living. For that, we require our solidarity across unions, countries, and regions. It has to be as connected as the supply chains that bind us. With this, I extend my gratitude to our panelists for their honesty, their expertise, time, and their commitment. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We saw some questions also in the Q&A box. Due to time constraints, we are not able to address them here, but we will be getting back to you via email. Please stay connected, follow us on social media, and spread the word. Thank you to our interpreters and our tech team members. Hope this is just the beginning of bigger dialogues and bolder actions for dignified and just work. Thank you.
Thank you.